Chapter 1 Confession. After midnight, the black coils were always visible, moving in the darkness. Out of the corner of his eye, Jack perceived them without ever being able to look directly at them, to observe them. They moved like snakes, slithering where they desired, even over top of each other. It was a writhing mass that didn't seem to have a single mind or unified goal. Whether they were a force of nature or something far more sinister was a question for someone else. Since the accident, it was impossible not to notice them, whatever these vile things were. All he knew is that they were everywhere, always lurking in the darkness. The terror that gripped him the first time he witnessed the phenomenon never truly left. Instead, it became like a broken bone, a pain that was adapted to in order to be endured. He had left his car behind a few blocks back. It was unlikely he would return to it any time soon, and he certainly didn't need to hunt for it in some impound lot. Besides, going on foot would attract less attention, at least if anyone was watching him arrive. He'd had enough of nurses, reporters, and police to last a lifetime. Jack didn't understand how any of those celebrities could stand it, always surrounded by the flash of cameras, never alone with their thoughts, the constant probing questions and unsolicited opinions. It was enough to make him sick thinking about it. His hands were shaking in his coat pockets, in part because of the chilly November wind, but fear played a part as it always had. He reached into his inner pocket and produced a silver flask, a gift from his wife. She thought it was cool and stylish, but all of her gifts were meant for a man he never was. Kim wanted to groom him, to mold him from the lumpy, featureless blob into the shape of the man that she desired. At the time, he barely drank liquor at all, even in social settings. His father had sapped all the joy out of drinking before he left kindergarten. Since the accident, he found a good whiskey calmed his nerves, whichever ones were still firing. He took a long pull from it and put it back. The last 3 concrete steps led him to the door. He let himself in and walked a long hallway, looking for Carson's office. It was a small town. Every baker, reporter, neighbor, and cop that lived around here knew him by name. The reporters were outsiders, sure, but the small-town familiarity of knowing everyone he saw was once a comfort. With Carson, he was even more familiar than that. They went to the same high school together, though they were in different social circles. Carson was well-liked and well-known, putting them on opposite ends of the pecking order. These days, Jack still wasn't outgoing or social like the local bar crowd, but he felt like part of the community nonetheless. That only made it so much harder once a spotlight was cast upon him, to be thrust out into the front of that same community as an object of pity. After that came the doleful looks of well-wishers he'd never met. Their faces told him everything. He's the poor fellow that lost his wife. He survived that horrific car accident. A light was on in the office, sending its beam into the dim hallway, throwing shadows where it could not reach. Jack averted his eyes, not to avoid them, but to check from the corner of his eye. They were still there, even in here. Coils of black, rippling and swelling, contracting and sliding all about in silence. No one else could see them, or seem to be aware of their presence. The only thing more horrifying than the sight of them were the memories of what waited within, what visions were on the other side. Though Jack made no attempt to step softly, the muscled, authoritative man behind the desk startled as he entered. Jack put out a hand before Carson could rise from his seat. It was going to be a long night. It was better if they were both sitting down. "Jack, I didn't hear you," he said, surprised. Shaking his head, Jack replied, "I'm sorry. I know it's late. This couldn't wait till morning. May I sit?" Carson nodded and motioned to the chair before his desk, an invitation to sit where many had before. They had come to tell their stories, the crimes done to them, embellishing their tales to exonerate them of any wrongdoing. For others, it was a place to confess their sins, to lie, deflect guilt, or face punishment. He wondered if there was anyone else like him, someone that had sat in the chair before the large, imposing authoritarian and spoke unfiltered truth. Everyone lies, even if only a little. People sometimes didn't know why they did it, but did it all the same. Fibs, white lies, exaggerations, omissions. He wanted nothing to do with any of those. This was too important. If he wasn't absolutely honest, accounting everything that had happened, he could be dismissed. That was the one thing he could not let happen. "You want a coffee or anything?" Carson asked, a courtesy his expression said wasn't genuine. "It's not necessary," Jack replied, shaking his head again. "No, I need to tell you about everything. About that night, my time in the hospital, the things I've seen." "You've been through enough, Jack," the man said with a sense of finality. He was already prepared to dismiss him. Raising a finger, Jack looked him right in the eye. In that moment, something changed. Carson's demeanor changed, as if he'd realized it wasn't the same Jack he thought he knew. He wasn't the person other people described, the pussy Carson might have passed in the halls at school. With their eyes locked to one another, man to man, Jack told Carson he didn't really know him at all. "I didn't come here for your sympathy," Jack replied. His hands trembled again, but he kept them in his lap. Balling a fist before straightening it back out and resting it on the desk for emphasis, he said, "I need you to understand what's happened to me, how I survived all of this. Most importantly, I need to confess." No words passed for several moments. Carson's brow twisted as he stared into Jack's soul and pondered the matter. Eventually, he came back to one word. "Confess?" "Yes," Jack replied. "To a crime?" "Yes." Another pause. Reaching into his desk, Carson produced a small tape recorder, the kind that used those micro cassettes. Jack didn't even know where to buy those things. He held it up for Jack to see and asked, "So I'll be recording this?" Jack nodded back, the question more a distraction from his point. "Sure, that's fine. Do what you have to." Carson pressed the red button on the tape recorder and set it down between them. Jack looked around the office, settling on the view out the window to his right. Beyond the glass, the night moved about, slithering around the frame. Hundreds of those snake-like creatures slid over top of each other, like a nature documentary featuring scores of centipedes filling the camera. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end. "I can see things now," he said, his voice low, his eyes transfixed to the movements he could only see in his periphery. "Since the accident, something happened to my vision. Maybe it unlocked something in me. I can see things now I shouldn't see. I know things about the world that I shouldn't know. I don't think any man was ever meant to see them." As if testing his patience, Carson sighed before asking, "What things do you see?" Jack turned to meet his gaze once again, letting out a bitter laugh of contempt. "When you were a kid, you remember shutting off your lights at bedtime? The light switch was always on the other side of the room, and you'd run like hell for the safety of your bed." "Of course," the man laughed back, as if recalling the fear fondly. "Only my bedroom was up a flight of stairs to this loft my parents made for me in the attic. I'd run up those stairs like the devil himself was after me." "Not the devil," Jack replied. Cocking his head to the side, Carson leaned in. "Pardon?" "Something was after you. After all of us," Jack replied. His eyes drifted back to the window. "I can see them now. That feeling you felt back then, that some unseen force waited in the dark to come after you, we were right. It was always there. We grew up, our senses dulled to it, but they never left us. You get glimpses of it now, when you're out at night and you see something out of the corner of your eye, a figure that moves toward you without a sound. You look at it and see the shadow of a telephone pole across a wet street. You dismiss it as your imagination running away with you, that you're tired, that you were wrong. But you weren't. It was there. It was coming for you." Carson's eyes narrowed. He had those dark brown eyes, almost black, that swallowed everything around him. Those eyes studied every move, analyzed every word, and made judgments on his subjects from atop his throne behind the desk. It didn't matter if he believed Jack, or wasn't sure what to make of him. All that mattered was the cold truth, one that could not be dismissed or walked away from. "It's not important that you believe every word I say," Jack said, changing the subject. "You're probably not going to want to believe anything I have to tell you. What you choose to accept isn't up to me. I'm going to tell you the whole truth of everything, the places I've been and the things I've seen. All that matters is that you know I'm not lying." He nodded back. "All right." 1,000 times between home and here, Jack played over what he'd say. Still, Carson's acquiescence meant that it was time to tell the truth of everything, the darkness that lies in the shadows and the horrible things it made him see. Part of him was surprised he got this far. Going back was out of the question. Even with his heart rising to his throat, he needed to break his silence. The burden needed to belong to someone else now. He was done with it. "The first thing I remember when I woke up on October 7th was the voice of my sister," Jack said, dolefully staring at the tiny spinning wheels of the tape recorder. Looking Carson in the eyes was too hard. He'd have to work up to it. "My sister had to bring me up to speed. I'd been gone so long." Carson shifted in his chair, settling in with a guarded posture, laying his forearm on the desk, a wall between him and Jack. For once, he wouldn't have to threaten or cajole or deceive to get the truth out of anyone. No, this would be handed to him on a silver platter. Jack was ready to confess. Thank you for listening to the first chapter of my book, In Shadows by D.C. Fergerson, a psychological horror available today on Amazon in ebook and paperback. Check the links in the description below to get your copy.